Hello, friends. Hello, Lou.
I got to switch us over there.
Okay.
You're the lead speaker here. How are we doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good.
I promise you, friends, that what you're going to listen to today is going to be, if you haven't heard this already, and many have not, you're going to be absolutely fascinated by the history of Christmas. You excited, Lou?
I am excited. Again, because we've touched upon this a little bit before, and this is part being raised Catholic, actually, and Christian in the West. I had no idea of these connections, so I do find this fascinating.
And I have to give credit for Lou because we were going to jump right into the next chapter here. And Lou said, how about we do a field trip? Because we're so close to Christmas, maybe our listeners would be interested in hearing how Christmas came about. So I hope you find this interesting, friends. Bear with me, and I think you will if you haven't heard this already.
Excellent.
So let's go back many thousands of years ago, many thousands of years before Jesus was born, Jesus the man, before Jesus Christ was born.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, what were the religions on this earth? There was no Christianity. Jesus wasn't even born.
Right.
There was no Islam. There was no Judaism. So those Abrahamic religions didn't exist. There was basically Hinduism in the beginning, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then when the Hindus produced, when Gautam Buddha was born, Siddhartha was born, he turned into to study Hinduism, and he found some issues over there that he did not agree with,
Right.
minor ones, but he then decided to form his own form of religion, which is Hinduism. A lot of similarities, more similarities than not,
Right.
except for the few that he didn't agree with, and he formed Buddhism. So there was Hinduism and Buddhism. And 3,101 years ago, there was the Mahabharat War. There was major earthquakes, cataclysms, and the war was over. All the warriors on both sides of the war, whoever survived, there were millions killed, many killed. They all left India and started traveling both east and west. Now, this is a part that you may say, what does this have to do with Christmas? But it does, believe me. So they moved westward, and they moved at that time. There was no Greece or Italy or Rome or the
Right.
Middle East or UK, United Kingdom. Everything basically was generated from China and India. Those were the two countries that were available. And there were there was no civilization or whatever in Italy, Greece, etc.
Right.
The people who then moved, imagine when I came here from India to the United States, and I've been here close to 50 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
And in those 50 years, I've had children here and now grandchildren. And I can tell you there's a major difference. My kids have some little knowledge of Indian scriptures and prayers and stuff, but not the way they would have had they been born and brought up in India. And
Sure.
my grandchildren less. And this is just in 50 years. What happens, imagine, in 1,000 years? So those religions that left from India and went first to Iran, because the Persia is what was one of the major countries at that time, which was formed by a sage called Parshuram. Parshuram was a warrior, and Persia became a very warlike, just like Parshuram. And they started praying to Mitra. Mitra was the Indian god of gods, all the small gods that we've talked about before.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Mitra was and so Persia started praying to Mitra, the god. So they had multiple gods. And as generations went by, these worshippers of multiple religions were started to call pagans. So some people thought that pagan came from the word of India, which is God. We call the God, we've referred to him in these episodes as Brahman. At that time, they called God Bhagwan.
Oh.
And so Bhagwan was another word for pagan. Those who worshiped Bhagwan were called pagans. But in Rome, in Italy, these pagans were called because of the Latin word pagano, which is similar to paisano. Paisan meaning,
Friend. Yeah.
a friend, a companion. But pagano is like those who lived in the villages. and were less sophisticated and cultured than those in the cities. So the Paganos had a worship of the 21st of December, which was the longest night of the year and the shortest day. Now, at that time, the main religion was not Hinduism in that area of Rome, Italy, Greece, etc., but that which the pagans worshipped, which having come from India, there was no Christianity at the time. So the pagan religions, having come from India, was rampant. So in India, as we've seen before, the spring solstice is thought of very highly, March 21st, and the winter solstice, December 21st. So December 21st was a very important date because it was the shortest day, and from then on, the days got longer. So it was almost like the return of life and light to the world because of the longer days. So the sun was supposedly coming back. So Christianity today serves a very valuable purpose, and Christmas does, because it celebrates the birth of Jesus, the man. And it was called the Feast of Nativity. So that was what Christmas was. But basically, it was also came from, at that time in ancient Rome, they found that the pagans celebrated it on December 25th. Don't forget, in Italy at that time, we've talked about the fact that there was no month of December.
Right.
There was no month of December. There was no months until actually March, because they said if the army doesn't have to march, they don't march in the winter. It's too cold and slushy and icy. So no months were there. And it was only after the Gregorian calendar and the Julian calendar that they started to have months over there. So there was no December 25th. But the days they figured after the sun went down on December 21st, making it the shortest day, each day got longer, and December 25th, even though there was no calendar, approximately, was when the pagans celebrated this as Saturnalia. Saturn, the planet, Saturnalia. Saturnalia was the god of agriculture. And so these pagans worshiped the god of agriculture. There was a lot of merriment. There was gift giving. There was candle lighting. There was singing. There was decorating houses at the time. And a lot of merrymaking. So at that time, all the wine that had been harvested was when it came about in that time, in Christmas time. So they had, and in Scandinavia, in Germany, they would bring a father and his sons would go out and pick up the biggest, heaviest log they could bring. That was called the Yule.
Yule log, right? Yeah.
Yule log. And they would burn it. And it might take 12 days. And they said, as long as it burns, you can drink, you can eat, you must drink and eat, and have sexual indiscretions. So that time was a time that all rules were put aside. And they drank and they ate, and a lot of cows and bulls were slaughtered at that time. Why? Because they would have less to feed, and they would eat more themselves because it was winter. So a lot of things happened that were not so good. So when the ancient Romans, the religion that was picked was Christianity, and this happened 400 years after the death of Jesus Christ. And at that time, they decided that they knew that Jesus was not born in the winter because of the wise old men. You know, they said that there were, well, what was it, Lou, shepherds herding the cows, herding the sheep, right? Am I right?
Yes.
So they said in the winter, you wouldn't be herding the sheep outside. That only happens in the spring and the summer. So we know that, and for a number of other reasons, because the Puritans in England said that there's nowhere in the Bible that it says that Jesus was born in any particular season.
Right.
Definitely not in winter. And nowhere in the Bible that says that Jesus was born around this time of year. But we do know that the Romans decided that this was paganism versus Christianity. And Christianity was just being born around 400 AD.
Right.
And they said in order to get more people to follow this festival, we should then deem that the festival that you celebrate, Saturnalia, which was more hedonistic, should be one dedicated towards Christ. So in Scandinavia, they said that it was the followers of Odin. In the German, it was Odin.
Yep.
Now, again, that also comes from the word, these were Buddhist followers. At that time, the Scandinavians, etc., were followers of Buddha, and Buddha was known as Bodhin.
Oh,
Bodhin.
yeah.
Yeah. Buddha, we usually often put the term in at the end. So Buddhan was the Sanskrit way of calling for Buddha. Buddhan, as it came to the West, in Scandinavia and Germany, etc., became Bodhin, and Bodhin was shortened in Scandinavia to Odin,
Right.
and in Germany, Odin. Now, Odin rode across the sky on an 8-legged horse, and that led to the symbol of Saint Nicholas riding by on
Eight
the
reindeer.
reindeer,
Oh my
8
God.
reindeer.
Wow.
And at the time, Saint Nicholas was a monk in Turkey, 280 AD, and he got an inheritance of a large, very wealthy estate. And he actually then rode around in his carriage, throwing coins out of his carriage towards poor people. So that led to Saint Nicholas dropping gifts down the chimney.
Wow.
And in Scandinavia, they took these trees, evergreen trees that there were all along, Christmas trees, and then it said this is the symbol of life, that these trees don't die in the winter. This is life.
Right.
Life is coming back. And they would then, for festivities, take a bright red apple, because those are the only fruits they had at the time, and hang it off of the tree. So red and green became the colors of Christmas, and ornaments hanging on the Christmas tree became that. Now, after the early years of Christianity, at that time we knew that Easter was the main holiday, not Christmas. The Pope Julius I chose December 25th to be Christmas. It went to Egypt in the year 432 AD, and to the United Kingdom 500 AD, and then to Scandinavia 700 AD. But the Western churches followed the Gregorian calendar. The Eastern churches followed the Julian calendar, which was 13 to 14 days behind the Gregorian. I never understood for a long time why my Armenian and Turkish friends celebrated Christmas so much later. Now I understand, because I know about the Julian and the Gregorian calendar. We've talked about it in one of our earlier field trips.
Yes.
Now, from England, who was it? Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a very strict puritanical person, and he said, we will not celebrate Christmas. And since you and I are both residents of the Boston area, you'll find this very interesting. Did you know, Lou, that Christmas was not allowed to be celebrated here in the Boston area for about 30 years?
I did not.
It was
What time period?
It was a law that from 1659 to 1689, 30 years, Christmas was outlawed in Boston. You may not celebrate Christmas. In fact, shops and businesses and schools and colleges were open, but the churches were closed, because you may not even go to church to pray at that time, because they said this is not something that was prescribed by the church or Bible. This is a pagan holiday, and if you celebrate it, you're basically giving credence or more importance to the pagan ideas.
Right.
The Puritans said that their more sins were committed against the Bible and Jesus Christ in the 12 days of Christmas than in all the 12 months combined before that. So they said, absolutely not, no Christmas. So then what changed? What changed was the fact that in 1819, there was a sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. That was his name, the name of the book, the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gentleman, by an author called Washington Irving. At that time, America, the United States of America, had two classes. One was extremely wealthy and one was the workers.
Right.
And there was this concept of a game called Lord of Misrule, that they practiced in Europe. It started in Rome, where the Romans had the same sort of thing, where they were extremely wealthy and they were very poor people. So at that time, it was almost like Halloween, where the poor people could come to the houses of the rich, knock on their doors, bang on their doors, and say, I want the most expensive wine given to me, serve me, you rich person. I'm going to sit at your table, you serve me, and give me the best of food that you have, and you serve me. Even though, and if you don't, it led to violence,
Yeah.
or you were allowed to do tricks on them. It was like trick or treat.
Right.
And so then they started appointing somebody who was either a beggar or a young student to be what's known as the Lord of Misrule. And he said what could be the rule at that time. Whatever you wanted, you could do. So that's why the Puritans said basically there was this Lord of Misrule. And this was actually something that was practiced in New York City and the United States back when the Puritans said, stop this.
Yeah.
So it led to those two classes. And so Washington Irving wrote in his book, Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman, that he said, look, Christianity as it was practiced earlier, the way it should have been practiced, the way it was practiced back in the days of Rome, which is not true, was that people were nice to the less wealthy people. People took care of them. People took care of families. They gave gifts, all of which was made up by Washington Irving, because that's not how we just saw that. That's not how Christmas was celebrated. So people were fascinated by that. That was in 1819. And then on December 23rd of 1823 came a book called A Visit by St. Nicholas. And the first sentence of that book was, it was the night before Christmas. So that made people think, this is what Christmas is all about. This is, we need to be at home. St. Nicholas comes. And then in December 19th, 1843, came Charles Dickens' book called Christmas Carol.
Right.
And all of these three main literary pieces of work, the Geoffrey Crayon, The Visit by St. Nicholas, and Christmas Carol, led to the federal government declaring in USA in June of 1870 that Christmas could be allowed as a holiday. Not until 1870.
Wow.
That was what, 130 years ago?
Just
150 years ago. Christmas, Washington's birthday, and 4th of July were deemed to be federal holidays in 1870. Not until then. But, I have to say that today, Christmas is thought of as a very important and good holiday, something that I've enjoyed a lot. I wanted to go downstairs and show you all my Christmas celebrations from the time my kids were young. We had Christmas trees in our house with decorations, and it was such a happy time. My friends, all who celebrated Christmas,
yes,
we went to church, enjoyed it, and it actually brings about the best in a lot of people. But that's not how it was years ago. And I just wanted to, thanks to you, Lou, for bringing this to my attention, to bring it out. And I hope you found that interesting. I hope if you have any questions.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. And I think we need to look at the Mahabharata Wars, or I'd like to talk about that in detail a little bit in a further episode, because that seemed like a dispersion point where people started to leave India and started to populate Southern Europe and Western Europe and things like that. And we don't have a real handle. Here in the West, we're descendants of Europeans, and we have a certain idea of European culture. We don't know the history that goes back to the dispersion of people from India to parts of Europe and bringing along a lot of these traditions. So I find all that very fascinating, because it becomes part of my culture now. Because I'm European in nature. I'm Italian and I'm Irish. I'm a European descendant. So attaching that to my ancestry and my history and my culture, I find fascinating.
Good. We will, thanks to you, we have this episode today with Christmas. And thanks to you, we'll talk about that other aspect, where how people dispersed from India 3,101 years before the Common Era.
Yeah, and how how they are the roots of the European culture, which became Western culture. as well. Especially you talk about the Scandinavians a lot and the Vikings too, and Thor and Odin and all of that. I didn't realize that that's where the roots lie. I find it fascinating.
Yeah. So in England, when the British came to rule over India at the time, they found it pretty interesting that these were our own sons and daughters and grandchildren and cousins coming back, declaring that they were our rulers,
It's
because
interesting, isn't
yeah,
it? Yeah.
because they came from the Himalayan regions. There's a book by a person called Edward Pocock, and he writes in there that there were the Sakas, Saka, Saka tribe, and the Sunni tribe,
Yeah.
and together the Saka Sunnis joined together, and then they were the very strong people, the Saka Sunnis. And when they moved to Great Britain, they were just called at that time, instead of calling Saka Sunnis, they called them Saxons.
Oh,
So,
amazing. Yeah.
so the Saxons came back, the Saka Sunnis came back to India to rule over us.
See, it's fascinating how it all wraps around. And again, this attachment between the East and the West here is just fascinating. And I know we're going to do more of it. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and there's many. There's a person called Gene Matlock who's written a lot about how the United States and it's a coincidence that the Native Americans, who are called the Indians, were actually Indian in origin. And Gene Matlock, who is a person living in California, has written extensively because he spoke the Native American languages, and he found out that there's so much in there that basically comes from their origins in India. And they at that time crossed across Alaska. There was a land bridge over there at that time.
Yes. Yeah. I think we just outlined 2 or 3 more field trips here.
All right, Lou, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you found this of interest, and I hope you join us again next time.
I hope everybody has a Merry Christmas, right?
Yes, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas.